Deep in the ancient Appalachian mountains, long before history was written in books, there was a secret war. But this wasn't a war of armies and generals. It was a silent, terrifying struggle between the creatures of the sun and the prisoners of the dark. Imagine a race of people so pale they looked like walking corpses, with skin that shimmered like moonlight, and eyes so large and reflective they could see the heat of your breath in pitch blackness. They built massive stone fortresses that still baffle archaeologists today, defying everything we know about indigenous history. They weren't myths, they were neighbors. And then, overnight, they vanished. To understand the mystery that haunted the Cherokee elders for centuries, we must unlock 4 doors into the past. Door number 1 is the phantom biology. Door number 2 is the stone paradox. Door number 3 is the war of light. And finally, door number 4 is the vanishing. Stay with us, because what lies behind door number 4 might just rewrite the history of the entire North American continent and challenge everything you think you know about who really walked these lands first. Let's step through the first door. Imagine you are standing in the deep, virgin woods of ancient Georgia. It is pitch black. The year is unknown. You feel safe in the dark, but you shouldn't. The Cherokee called them the moon-eyed people. While the rest of the world worshipped the sun, these beings recoiled from it as if it were acid. Their skin was translucent, a ghostly alabaster that seemed to shimmer under the lunar glow, veins visible like blue rivers on a map of ice. But it was their eyes that froze the blood of anyone unlucky enough to spot them. Pause the frame right here and look closer at those eyes. They aren't human, not entirely. They are enormous, round, and pale blue, evolved not for the beauty of the day, but for the brutal clarity of the night. Like an owl, they capture every stray photon of starlight. In the dark, they see you perfectly, tracking your heartbeat from the tree line. In the day, they are blind, helpless, and burning. This biological curse forced them into a life of absolute shadow. They were compact, fragile, and physically small, distinct from the tall, athletic Cherokee warriors who would eventually surround them. But while the city slept, a catastrophe was already ticking beneath their feet. Don't mistake their physical fragility for weakness. While they couldn't fight in the sun, they built something that would outlast their own extinction. High on the ridges, hidden by the canopy, they constructed fortresses that defy the architectural logic of the time. The Cherokee lived in wooden lodges, organic and temporary. The moon-eyed people built with the bones of the earth, heavy, cold, permanent stone. At Fort Mountain in Georgia, a wall stretches over 850 feet, a winding serpent of rock that serves no clear purpose to the modern eye. But to them, it was the difference between life and death. Step inside one of these ruins in your mind. The air here smells of damp earth, ozone, and ancient dust. The temperature drops 10 degrees instantly. The walls are thick, overlapping masonry, designed to block out every single ray of the lethal sun. The doorways are narrow, almost suffocatingly small, forcing you to bow, to submit, just to enter. It was a tomb for the living, a bunker against the daylight. They lived in a liminal space, a terrifying purgatory between the spirit world and the physical realm. Inside, they huddled around central hearths, the firelight dancing in those massive reflective eyes, waiting for the sun to die so they could truly live. For generations, these two civilizations existed in parallel. The Cherokee claimed the day. The Moon-Eyed people claimed the night. It was an unspoken truce held together by fear and curiosity. The Cherokee watched the ridges with suspicion, seeing the faint glow of fires behind stone walls, wondering if these pale neighbors were men or monsters. They were reclusive, silent, and ghostly, leaving behind no footprints and no whispers. But peace is a fragile thing when two species share the same resources but live in different worlds. The Cherokee population was growing, pushing deeper into the mountains, and that fragile silence was about to be shattered by a sound that would echo through history. The life of the Moon-Eyed people was a perfect inversion of the natural order, a rhythm dictated entirely by the phases of the lunar cycle. While the Cherokee basked in the warmth of the sun, these beings lay in a coma-like state within their stone tombs, waiting for the world to turn gray and cold. But when the sun dipped below the horizon, they didn't just wake up, they dominated the darkness. Under the cover of a full moon, their weakness evaporated. The light that blinded them during the day became their fuel at night, guiding them through the dense Appalachian canopy with a supernatural precision. They moved through the underbrush without snapping a single twig, their pale bodies slipping through the trees like smoke, hunting nocturnal prey, bats, small animals, things that scuttled in the dark alongside them. To a Cherokee scout watching from a distance, they weren't people. They were spirits of the night, terrifyingly silent and perfectly adapted to a world where humans were supposed to be blind. But while the city slept, a catastrophe was already ticking beneath their feet. The origin of these ghosts is where the story shifts from history to horror. Cherokee oral tradition doesn't just call them neighbors. It suggests they were something far more unsettling. Some elders whispered that the Moon-Eyed people were never human to begin with, but spirits trapped in physical form, forced to endure the agony of the material world until they could find a way back to the shadow realm. Others believed they were the tragic survivors of a forgotten apocalypse, a lost civilization that had been forced underground by a plague or environmental disaster centuries prior, evolving over generations into these subterranean albinos just to survive. Imagine the terror of a people so broken by the surface world that they had to become monsters of the dark just to keep breathing. They were living fossils, remnants of a timeline that should have ended long ago. Tension began to rot the peace between the two tribes. The Cherokee were expanding, their need for fertile valleys and hunting grounds pushing them closer and closer to the stone fortresses that marked the Moon-Eyed people's territory. It started with subtle signs, footprints in the soft earth that didn't match any known moccasin, the eerie feeling of being watched by eyes that reflected the starlight like mirrors. Cherokee hunters would freeze in the woods, the hair on their arms standing up, sensing a presence that vanished the moment they turned their heads. The silence of the Moon-Eyed people wasn't peaceful anymore. It was heavy, pregnant with a threat that no one could articulate. They refused to trade, refused to speak, and refused to leave. The atmosphere in the mountains shifted from curiosity to dread. The Cherokee began to view these reclusive neighbors not as victims of nature, but as harbingers of misfortune, omens that something terrible was coming. Rumors spread like wildfire through the Cherokee villages that the Moon-Eyed people could curse their enemies or summon disasters, their strange, large eyes acting as windows into a darker magic. Fear is a powerful motivator, and as the Cherokee encroached further, the Moon-Eyed people retreated deeper into their stone shells, their silence now interpreted as a sinister plot rather than simple fear. The mountain air smelled of ozone and ancient dust, and the nights grew longer and colder. The unspoken truce was fracturing. The Cherokee warriors, tall and fierce, looked at the stone walls and realized that coexistence was no longer an option. A collision was inevitable, and it would not be fought with diplomacy, but with a calculated brutality that would exploit the one fatal weakness the moon-eyed people could never overcome. The mountains were suffocating under the weight of an impossible coexistence. As the Cherokee expanded their territory, they pushed inevitably into the high, rocky ridges where the moon-eyed people had built their silent kingdom. The buffer zone evaporated. Cherokee hunters began finding footprints that shouldn't exist and feeling eyes on their backs in the pitch blackness, a sensation that turned seasoned warriors into paranoid insomniacs. The silence of the moon-eyed people was no longer viewed as peaceful. It was interpreted as the quiet before an ambush, a supernatural breath held before a scream. Rumors curdled into certainty that these pale watchers were spies, witches, or bringers of a curse that would rot the Cherokee from the inside out. But while the villages whispered of ghosts, the War Council was planning a slaughter. The strategy was ruthless in its simplicity. The Cherokee knew they could not win a war in the dark against an enemy that could see the heat of their blood. So they decided to weaponize the cosmos itself. They waited for the one moment when their enemy's greatest strength would become a fatal flaw: the dawn. Under the cover of the vanishing night, Cherokee warriors crept up the ridges surrounding the stone fortresses, listening to the unsuspecting breathing of a civilization about to end. The air was cold, smelling of damp leaves and impending violence. The silence so loud it hummed against their eardrums. They didn't strike at midnight. They waited, muscles coiled like iron springs, for the first traitorous gray light of morning to bleed over the horizon. When the sun finally breached the mountain peaks, it didn't just bring light, it brought agony. The Cherokee stormed the walls the instant the rays hit the stone, catching the moon-eyed people in a state of biological shock. Imagine the terror of waking up not to a battle, but to a blinding, burning white wall of pain. The sunlight that gave the Cherokee life rendered the moon-eyed people instantly helpless, their sensitive nocturnal eyes overwhelmed by the glare, blinding them as effectively as a hot iron. It wasn't a battle, it was a purge. The moon-eyed people stumbled in the brilliance, shielding their faces, unable to target the warriors cutting them down. They tried to retreat into the shadows of their own homes, but the sun was relentless, and the Cherokee were faster. The stone fortresses, built to keep the world out, became slaughter pens, trapping them in the light they had spent centuries avoiding. The survivors didn't just run, they vanished into the veins of the earth. Broken, blinded, and hunted, the remaining moon-eyed people fled into the deepest, most inaccessible fractures of the Appalachian crust. Imagine the desperation of that flight. You are stumbling through the underbrush, your skin blistering under the morning sun, seeking the only safety left, the eternal darkness of the caves. The Cherokee legends say they retreated into these subterranean voids, trading the sky for a ceiling of stone, becoming true creatures of the dark. They didn't die out. They evolved downwards. Over centuries, the story goes, they adapted to a life entirely underground, their eyes growing even wider, their skin losing all pigment, existing as pale ghosts that would only emerge on the darkest nights to gather food before slipping back into the rock. To this day, Hunters in the deep woods report seeing fleeting, pale figures near cave entrances, hearing whispers that sound like language but feel like wind. But while the city slept, a catastrophe was already ticking beneath their feet. The physical scars of their existence are still carved into the landscape, defying every explanation we try to force upon them. At Fort Mountain in Georgia, an 850-foot stone wall still snakes along the ridge, a massive, winding fortification that serves no obvious ceremonial purpose. It is a military structure, built by people who knew they were being hunted. The masonry is distinct, unlike the wooden and earthen structures typical of the Cherokee, hinting at a knowledge of engineering that shouldn't have existed there. Yet the silence is deafening. There are no tools, no pottery, and most hauntingly, no bodies. It is as if they were beamed off the planet, leaving only their walls to prove they were ever real. This absence of evidence has birthed a chaotic storm of theories. Some argue they were a lost colony of Welsh explorers, led by Prince Madoc in the 12th century, white-skinned refugees who built stone forts because that's what they did back in Wales. Others suggest they were a genetic anomaly, a tribe of indigenous people with albinism who were ostracized and forced into the night to survive the sun. But here is the twist that changes the entire picture. We look at the Moon-Eyed People as monsters, as aliens or spirits, because they were different. We fear their pale skin and their large eyes. But history is written by the victors. The Cherokee called them strange and ominous because they refused to assimilate, because they held on to their own way of life in the face of overwhelming pressure. The irony is suffocating. The Moon-Eyed People were likely not aggressors, but refugees, a small, fragile group of isolationists who just wanted to be left alone in the dark. They built walls not to conquer, but to hide. The monster in this story wasn't the pale figure in the woods. It was the intolerance of the daylight world that couldn't abide a mystery it couldn't control. This isn't just ancient history. It is a mirror for how we treat the other today. We live in a society that demands visibility, extroversion, and conformity. If you are quiet, if you stay in the shadows, if you don't play by the rules of the daylight, you are viewed with suspicion. The Moon-Eyed People represent that part of us that just wants to retreat, to find a sanctuary where we don't have to perform for the crowd. They are the patron saints of the outcasts, the introverts, and the misunderstood. They remind us that sometimes survival doesn't mean fighting the war. It means finding a cave where the war can't touch you. So I have to ask you a binary question, and I want you to answer honestly in the comments. Do you believe the Moon-Eyed People were a supernatural entity that slipped back into the spirit world? Or were they flesh and blood refugees, perhaps Welsh or indigenous outcasts, who were wiped out by human tribalism? Choice A, spirits. Choice B, refugees. Make your choice, because the truth might be watching you from the dark right now. If you want to survive the next descent into the unknown, hit that subscribe button. We are just scratching the surface of the lost history of the Americas. And trust me, you do not want to be left in the dark for what comes next.